Picture this, an entire continent on fire. Not for days, not for months, but for 30 straight years. Imagine growing up and knowing nothing but war. Your entire childhood, war. Your teenage years, war. Getting married, having kids, still war. That was reality for an entire generation of Europeans. This wasn't just another medieval conflict. This was the apocalypse that created the modern world. And here's the crazy part. You've probably never heard the full story. Between 1618 and 1648, this war killed more people than the Black Death, wiped entire regions off the map. Some areas lost 75% of their population. 75%. But here's the plot twist that'll blow your mind. From this total destruction came the political system that still rules our world today. The way countries interact, the concept of national borders, even the separation of religion and politics. It all started in the blood-soaked fields of 17th century Europe. If you think you know what war looks like, you haven't seen anything yet. Hit that like button, because we're about to dive into the most brutal, most important war you've never heard of. First, let's talk about the powder keg that was about to explode, the Holy Roman Empire. But here's the thing, calling this an empire is like calling a jigsaw puzzle a single picture. We're talking about over 300 independent territories all crammed together. Kings, dukes, bishops, free cities, each with their own laws, their own armies, their own agendas. Imagine trying to run a country where every single county thinks it's its own nation. That's what the Holy Roman Emperor was dealing with. No wonder they had a saying, neither holy nor Roman nor an empire. It was a giant with feet of clay, just waiting for someone to give it a push. But the real-time bomb? Religion. A century earlier, Martin Luther had taken a sledgehammer to European Christianity. Catholics versus Protestants. And they hated each other with a passion that's hard to imagine today. The temporary fix was the Peace of Augsburg in 1555. Simple rule. Whoever rules the territory picks the religion. Catholic prince equals Catholic land. Protestant prince equals Protestant land. Sounds reasonable, right? Wrong. This was basically a grenade with the pin pulled. Problem number one. What about the Calvinists? They were ignored completely. Problem number two. What about all the church lands that Protestants had seized? Problem number three. Everyone thought God was on their side, and a final war was inevitable. Are you starting to see why this was going to end badly? At the center of this mess, the Habsburg dynasty. These guys were the original overachievers. They controlled Austria. They controlled Spain. They controlled the Netherlands. They controlled huge chunks of Germany. They even controlled parts of the Americas. Their dream? One Catholic Europe under one crown. Their crown for everyone else. This looked like a nightmare. France felt surrounded. Protestant princes feared for their lives. Even other Catholic kings worried the Habsburgs were getting too powerful. It was like a room full of dynamite, and everyone was holding matches. But wait, it gets worse. May 23rd, 1618, Prague Castle. A group of angry Protestant nobles had just about enough of Catholic oppression. Picture this. They stormed into the castle, grabbed two Catholic officials and their secretary, marched them to a high window, and threw them out. This is called the Defenestration of Prague. Fancy word for throwing people out of windows. And yes, this really happened. Plot twist, nobody died. They landed in a pile of manure. Catholics claimed it was divine intervention. Protestants said it was just good luck. Either way, this absurd incident just started a 30-year apocalypse. The Bohemian nobles weren't done. They kicked out their Habsburg king and offered the crown to Frederick V, a young Protestant prince. Frederick said yes. Worst decision ever. See, Frederick wasn't just any prince. He was married to the daughter of the King of England and ruled one of the most important German territories. His acceptance of the Bohemian crown was basically a declaration of war against the entire Habsburg Empire. He became known as the Winter King because his reign lasted about as long as a bad winter flu. November 8th, 1620, just outside Prague. This was it, the decisive showdown. On one side, Frederick's ragtag Bohemian rebels, mostly unpaid, poorly trained, and already having second thoughts. On the other side, the combined Catholic forces led by Johann Circles, Count of Tilly, professional soldier who'd been perfecting the art of war for decades. The battle lasted 2 hours. 2 hours to completely destroy the Protestant cause in Bohemia. Frederick fled so fast, he left his royal library behind. The Habsburgs didn't just win, they crushed Protestant Bohemia into powder. Mass executions, forced conversions, land confiscations. They turned Bohemia into a Catholic stronghold overnight. But here's the thing about crushing victories. Sometimes they scare your enemies so badly that they unite against you. And boy, were the Protestants about to unite. But then a new player entered the game. Christian IV of Denmark looked at what happened in Bohemia and thought, those Catholics are getting too powerful. Time to be the hero of Protestantism. Plus, he wanted some German territories for himself. Nothing wrong with mixing religious duty with personal profit, right? Christian marched into Germany with Danish armies and English money. He was about to meet someone who would redefine warfare itself, and that's when the most terrifying military genius you've never heard of stepped onto the stage. Albrecht von Wallenstein walked up to Emperor Ferdinand and made an offer that seemed too good to be true. Give me permission to raise an army, and I'll fund it entirely from conquered territories. You pay nothing. I'll make war pay for war. The emperor said yes. Huge mistake, but not for the reasons you'd think. Wallenstein created an army of 100,000 men. Massive for that time. That lived entirely off plunder. His soldiers didn't get paid salaries. They got permission to take whatever they needed from the countryside. Imagine an army of 100,000 locusts sweeping across your homeland, taking your food, your livestock, your daughters. That was Wallenstein's war machine. Christian IV learned this the hard way at the Battle of Lutter in 1626. The Danish king got his army obliterated and had to slink back to Denmark with his tail between his legs. But Wallenstein was just getting started. Drunk on victory, Emperor Ferdinand made a catastrophic decision in 1629, the Edict of Restitution. This decree demanded that Protestants return all church lands they'd taken since 1552. We're talking about massive territories, entire cities, the economic foundation of Protestant power. It was basically Ferdinand saying, thanks for the military victories, Protestants. Now give us everything back, or we'll take it by force. Even Catholic princes were horrified. They realized Ferdinand was trying to create a centralized empire with himself as absolute ruler. Nobody wanted that, not even his allies. The irony? Ferdinand's greatest victory created his greatest enemy coalition. Then in 1630, the most badass king in European history decided he'd had enough. Gustavus Adolphus of Sweden was about to change everything. This guy was 6'2", in an age when most men were 5'4". He spoke 9 languages, personally led cavalry charges, and had revolutionized military tactics. His soldiers called him the Lion of the North. But here's the kicker. Gustavus was funded by Catholic France. That's right. Catholic France was paying a Protestant king to fight Catholic Austria. Why? Because politics trumped religion. Cardinal Richelieu, France's chief minister, cared more about stopping Habsburg power than protecting Catholic unity. The religious war had just become a power struggle. Gustavus didn't just bring more soldiers. He brought the future of warfare itself, while everyone else was still fighting like it was 1500. Gustavus created lighter artillery, more flexible infantry formations, and cavalry that actually charged with swords instead of just firing pistols. His first major test came at Breitenfeld in 1631, facing the legendary Count Tilly and his seemingly invincible Catholic forces. Tilly had never lost a major battle. He was the terror of Protestant Europe. Gustavus crushed him in 4 hours. The Protestant cause was reborn overnight. The invincible Catholic armies suddenly looked very vincible indeed. Ferdinand panicked and did the only thing he could. He recalled Wallenstein. Now we had the ultimate showdown. The two greatest military minds of the age circling each other like heavyweight boxers. Gustavus Adolphus versus Albrecht von Wallenstein. The innovator versus the mercenary king. They met at Lutzen on November 16, 1632. In a battle fought in thick fog, where soldiers couldn't tell friend from enemy, the Swedes won the field. But in the chaos, Gustavus Adolphus was killed leading a cavalry charge. Protestant Europe had lost its champion. But Wallenstein's victory was Pyrrhic. He'd removed his greatest rival, but also eliminated the one man who might have ended the war quickly. Instead, the war was about to get much worse. Wallenstein himself would be assassinated by his own officers in 1634, suspected of planning to switch sides. With both military geniuses dead, the war lost its last chance for a quick resolution, and that's when France decided to stop playing games. 1635, Cardinal Richelieu looked at the chaos in Germany and made a calculated decision. It was time for Catholic France to officially declare war on Catholic Austria. Let that sink in. The most powerful Catholic nation in Western Europe just declared war on the Holy Roman Empire to ... help Protestants. Richelieu's logic was simple. Better a weak, divided Germany than a strong Habsburg Empire on our border. With this declaration, the 30 Years' War stopped being about religion at all. It became a naked power struggle for European dominance. And that's when the real horror began. With France in the game, armies swelled to unprecedented sizes, sometimes over 150,000 men. But nobody had figured out how to feed these massive forces. The solution? Let them feed themselves from the countryside by force. What followed was systematic devastation on a scale Europe had never seen. Armies didn't just pass through regions, they consumed them like swarms of locusts. Here's what a typical foraging expedition looked like. Soldiers would surround a village at dawn. They'd demand food, livestock, money, and whatever else they needed. If the villagers couldn't pay, the soldiers took it anyway, plus everything else they could carry. Houses were burned, crops were destroyed, wells were poisoned, women were assaulted. Anyone who resisted was killed. This wasn't war anymore. This was industrialized brutality. May 20th, 1631, would go down as one of the darkest days in European history. The Protestant city of Magdeburg had been under siege for months. When imperial forces finally broke through, what happened next became a byword for horror across Europe. The soldiers, unpaid and hungry, went completely berserk. They massacred civilians indiscriminately. They burned the city. They destroyed everything. When the smoke cleared, Magdeburg's population had dropped from 35,000 to about 5,000. The city was so thoroughly destroyed that grass grew in its streets for years. Afterward, this was just one city. Imagine this happening across an entire continent for decades. The numbers are almost impossible to comprehend. In some regions, Brandenburg lost 50% of its population. Werder lost 57%. Mecklenburg lost 70%. Some villages lost literally everyone. We're not just talking about soldiers dying in battle. We're talking about entire communities vanishing from existence. Disease was the biggest killer. Armies carried typhus, dysentery, and plague wherever they went. Malnourished civilians had no resistance. Then came famine, with crops destroyed year after year. People ate bark, grass, anything they could find. Cannibalism was reported in multiple regions. The Holy Roman Empire was being depopulated in real time. By the 1640s, everyone was exhausted. Treasuries were empty. Armies were deserting in massive numbers. Even the generals were sick of fighting. The Battle of Rocroi in 1643 marked the symbolic end of Spanish military dominance. The famous Spanish tercios, elite infantry formations that had dominated European battlefields for a century, were crushed by a young French prince, but nobody could deliver a knockout punch. The war had devolved into a stalemate of mutual exhaustion. Finally, in 1643, peace negotiations began. They would take 5 years to complete. Picture the most complex diplomatic negotiation in human history up to that point. Representatives from nearly every European power gathering in 2 German cities, Munster and Osnabrück, to untangle 3 decades of war. We're talking about hundreds of diplomats speaking different languages, representing different religions, all trying to redraw the map of Europe while the war was still raging around them. It took 5 years. 5 years of non-stop negotiation to figure out how to stop the killing. When the Peace of Westphalia was finally signed in October 1648, it didn't just end a war, it created the modern world. Here's what they established. Sovereignty. Each state has absolute authority. within its own borders. No more universal emperor, no more papal interference in politics. If you rule a territory, it's yours to govern as you see fit. This might sound obvious to us, but it was revolutionary in 1648. It meant the end of medieval universalism and the birth of the nation-state system we still use today. Religious freedom, sort of. Calvinism finally got recognition alongside Catholicism and Lutheranism, while individual religious freedom was still limited. At least states could coexist with different official religions. Balance of power. No single power should dominate Europe. If one gets too strong, the others should unite against it. The territorial changes were massive. Sweden gained control of the Baltic. France secured Alsace and became Europe's dominant land power. The Dutch and Swiss got formal independence. Holy Roman Empire was essentially dissolved into 300 independent states. The Habsburgs were still powerful, but their dream of European hegemony was dead. Most importantly, a new principle governed European politics: national interest over religious solidarity. The biggest loser was the Holy Roman Empire itself. The peace treaties gave German princes the right to make their own foreign policy, maintain their own armies, and sign their own treaties, as long as they didn't fight the emperor. In other words, the empire became a collection of independent states held together by nothing but tradition and paperwork. The Holy Roman Empire would limp along for another 158 years before finally dying in 1806. But for all practical purposes, it ended in 1648. When the cannons finally fell silent in 1648, Europe looked like a different planet. The human cost is almost incomprehensible. Conservative estimates put the death toll at 4 million. More realistic estimates suggest 8 million dead, in an era when the entire population of the German states was only about 20 million. That's potentially 40% of an entire population gone. But here's what makes it even worse. Most didn't die in battle. They died of starvation, disease, and systematic brutality against civilians. Villages that had thrived for centuries were simply gone, not destroyed, not abandoned, but completely depopulated. You could walk for miles through regions that had once supported thousands of people and see nothing but empty ruins and overgrown fields. For those who lived through it, the trauma was generational. Children who had grown up knowing only war had to learn how to live in peace. Former soldiers, brutalized by decades of conflict, had to somehow reintegrate into civilian society. The economic recovery took over a century in some regions. The social fabric had been so thoroughly shredded that entire ways of life simply disappeared forever. But from this apocalypse, something remarkable emerged. The 30 Years' War and accidentally created the blueprint for modern international relations. Permanent diplomatic corps, professional standing armies, the concept of state, sovereignty, international law, the balance of power system. These weren't planned outcomes. They evolved out of sheer necessity as European powers tried to prevent another catastrophe like the one they just survived. The war also marked the end of religious wars in Europe. Oh, there would be plenty more conflicts, but they'd be fought for territory, trade, and national glory, not for salvation of souls. In the most brutal way imaginable, Europe had learned to separate politics from religion. The 30 Years' War was more than just a historical event. It was the violent birth of the modern world. Every time nations sign a treaty, every time they respect each other's borders, every time they choose diplomacy over religious crusade, they're following principles forged in the hell of 17th century Europe. The United Nations, NATO, the European Union, all of these institutions are descendants of ideas born in the Peace of Westphalia. But the war's most important lesson isn't about politics or diplomacy. It's about what happens when we let ideology override humanity, when we choose purity over compromise, when we decide that our cause justifies any means necessary. The 30-year apocalypse taught Europe a lesson it never forgot. Some victories aren't worth winning. Today, as we watch conflicts around the world, as we see religious and ideological divisions tearing societies apart, the ghost of the 30 Years' War whispers a warning from history. Be very careful what you're willing to destroy In the name of what you believe. Because sometimes when you think you're fighting for heaven, you create hell on earth. What do you think? Could something like the 30 Years' War happen again in our modern world? Are we smarter than our ancestors? Or are we just better at convincing ourselves that our wars are different? Let me know in the comments below. And if you want more stories about how historical catastrophes shaped our world, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Trust me, history is way more brutal and way more relevant than your high school teacher ever told you. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.